Hi everyone, I'm Professor Trent. Welcome to REL 110, Chapter 3 Lecture Summary. If you don't yet have your book out in front of you, please go run and get it. I'm going to be referencing page numbers in your Invitation to World Religions textbook. So please open up your book and meet me on page 61 if you have the third edition. We are studying the Indigenous Traditions of Africa. Note that your page numbers might be a little bit different if you have a different edition. No problem. They will be somewhere similar. So I'm going to reference specific things and you should be able to find them in your textbook. All right, friends, meet me on page 61. That is the beginning of the chapter. We open up with a beautiful illustration of an African indigenous ritual, followed by the map and timeline on page 62 and 63. Now you'll notice on the map of Africa, if you haven't studied a lot about Africa, both its geography and its history, you notice the diversity of countries. There are over 1 billion people in Africa. Africa is extremely diverse, which means that its religious, spiritual, indigenous traditions are also very, very diverse. So I encourage you to just take some time to look and explore the map of Africa on page 62 to get a sense for the diversity within the continent of Africa. There's also another map on page 64 that shows you in shading in the green area at the bottom which areas of Africa have the most percentage in terms of African indigenous beliefs. We're going to get to why that's important in just a moment. It has to do with Christianity and Islam, but if you'll take a minute to explore those two maps, page 62 and 64, that'll give you an idea of the diversity on the African continent. Now, Africa is a continent. It is not a country. There are many, many countries on the continent of Africa. So let's start with our 3-question framework: ultimate reality, way of life, and ultimate purpose. In African indigenous traditions, those first 2 categories are very important: ultimate reality and way of life. We're going to hear more about those 2 in particular. Ultimate purpose is always important in every tradition, but every tradition approaches it a little bit differently. As we go chapter to chapter, you'll see what those nuances are. And when it comes to the African indigenous traditions, there is more emphasis placed on ultimate reality and way of life rather than ultimate purpose. Way of life in particular is especially important in African indigenous traditions. So as we mentioned earlier, I'm on the bottom of page 63, there are 1 billion people on the continent of Africa. The continent of Africa is very diverse in terms of culture, belief system, ethnicity, language, and this is really important to remember because unlike North American indigenous traditions, which we studied, there's even more diversity. When I said unlike, what I meant was there are 3 countries on the continent of North America. Okay, 3 countries. Can you name them? Canada, United States, and Mexico. All right, and we talked predominantly about the North American indigenous traditions of the United States, of which there are about remaining 700 communities in terms of tribal beliefs and systems. On the continent of Africa, looking at the map, you can see how much more diverse and how much more in terms of numbers of countries and people, which equals more diversity in terms of belief systems. We had a lot of diversity in chapter 2. We have even more in chapter 3. So what we're going to do is talk about the large threads and themes that run through each of the categories: ultimate reality, way of life, ultimate purpose. Note that there is not one singular African culture. There is not one singular African religious or spiritual or indigenous belief system. There are many, many, many. However, there are some common themes that run through many of these beliefs and systems of practice. All right, so meet me on page 64 and 65, and we're going to talk about some of those common characteristics. So in African indigenous traditions, there is a particular emphasis on everyday practice. the emphasis is on improving life today, improving life right now, which means that religion and spirituality are infused in the practitioner's everyday life. You're also going to see this in Hinduism when we get to chapter 4. That means that all rituals, all things that are done during the day are all intertwined in terms of that person's spiritual and religious and community's belief systems. You'll get to see this more when we come to the rites and rituals portion of this chapter. So note that religious beliefs and practices are infused, all right, infused is a good word, and into the daily life, and they actually inform the daily life in Africa, including everyday concerns. So when we get to page 66, now we're getting into ultimate reality. So the big question is, what is the ultimate reality in African Indigenous traditions? Great question. The answer to that question is it's varied. It's extremely diverse, but most African Indigenous communities have some sort of belief in a supernatural being or God that created humanity and earth and the animals. And so beginning on page 66, you see this section on supernatural beings. This will walk you through a couple of different traditions, belief systems of ultimate reality. In other words, there is something from where we came, right? There's some supernatural being, there's some creative being that made creation, but that being tends to be very hands-off. And if you read the conclusion part of this chapter, you know that most traditions consider there to have been a rift, some sort of divide between God and humans, and therefore God is a bit distant from humanity. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But note that there is an ultimate reality of a supernatural being that has created the natural world. On page 66, where you can read more details about Amma and the High God and various ultimate realities from different communities on the African continent. If you watch the video on the Yoruba tradition, and if you haven't watched it, go back. It's in your unit, your module folder. You saw the initiation of the young Yoruba priestesses, all right? And hopefully you watched that. It was a great little short documentary. And you heard something called the Orisha. The Orisha is a pantheon of gods, or a pantheon of aspects of God within the Yoruba tradition. And so that would be one example of ultimate reality in African Indigenous traditions. That's on page 69 if you'd like to read more about that. So let's talk about what happens. We'll skip a little bit ahead to ultimate purpose, but when humans die, the question then becomes, and it's related to ultimate reality and way of life, is what is the line, the connection between living humans and deceased humans? Whether or not they had children, it doesn't matter. When we speak of ancestors in African Indigenous traditions, this is not unique to people who had children and grandchildren. Ancestors can be anyone in the community. And so when ancestors become ancestors, when they transition from this earth into the spiritual realm, they provide wisdom for those who are living, all right? Because African Indigenous traditions are what we call anthropocentric. Write that down, anthropocentric. That means that they are human-centered. All the rituals, way of life, narratives are focused on improving life here and now, today, in the present, in the human condition. Now, in order to do that, African Indigenous traditions use rituals, rites of passage, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, but also communication with the ancestors, spirits of the dead. We're on page 70. And this is really important because the spirits of the dead are often active in the lives of their relatives and in the communities for many, many generations. And so one gleans wisdom from the ancestors. And that's a really important part, beautiful part of African Indigenous traditions. You can read more about that on page 71. Anthropocentric, if you need that definition, is towards the bottom of page 71. It just merely means that Most African religions, spiritual, indigenous traditions are anthropocentric, which means that they recognize humanity is the center of the cosmos. Humanity is the center of the cosmos. Whereas in other traditions, you will often see that the ultimate reality is the center of the cosmos. This is a little bit different. And if you go back and read the conclusion, you understand a little more clearly why that is. So moving on to page 73, let's talk about the colonization of Africa. So we're at the history of indigenous traditions in Africa. So there are two major colonizers in Africa, and therefore two major global world religions that come to the continent of Africa. So keep in mind, historically, you have African indigenous traditions, which are as diverse as the indigenous communities themselves. And you saw the number of countries on the continent of Africa. And then with colonization, you have two major world religions that infiltrate the continent of Africa, and they are Christianity and Islam. Christianity and Islam. We are on page 73. And here's what this does to the continent of Africa. Not only does it introduce these two global religious traditions, often by force, to the continent of Africa, but what happens is that African indigenous traditions tend to adapt. They infuse parts of Islam and Christianity into the African indigenous religions themselves. This is not unusual at all. We saw this actually in North America as well, whereas European colonizers came over, crossed the Atlantic, landed on North American continent, brought Christianity with them, and then there's North American indigenous traditions, and there begins to be a fusion of the two. You saw that in the Cherokee video. The same thing happens on the continent of Africa. And this is in part because colonizers arrive on the continent. There is forced conversion into these two global traditions, but the indigenous people who live on that continent, it is their land and their continent, keep as many slivers and parts of their indigenous rituals and traditions as they possibly can, including narratives, language, rites of passage, rites of renewal, all kinds of rituals. Now, some of them, of course, get lost generation after generation because of the influence of the colonizers and the influence of the two global traditions. But some of the pieces are held onto and passed on generation to generation. So what you see, going back to that map, I think it was on page 63, is a fusion process. A fusion process wherein you have the pre-existing indigenous traditions from the continent that are native to that continent. You have the colonizers bringing their global religions, Islam and Christianity in this case, and you see a fusion of indigenous traditions and the global traditions. This is on page 64 where you see that map. Now, on this particular map, you see that there are variations of the green color, which indicate how much indigenous traditions are left in that particular country according to the data, okay? So that gives you an idea of what this looks like in terms of fusion process. All right, so there's more on page 74 about the history of Africa and colonialism. Please go back and read that. That's very important. Not only are we thinking about the Christianity and Islam coming to the continent of Africa, but then we have to consider historically the transatlantic slave trade, which means the enslavement, the forced enslavement of Africans, and then crossing over the Atlantic Ocean into North America. So that, historically, if you know your world history, we're talking about the late 1500s, early 1600s, and that runs until the 18th century. So the transatlantic slave trade is important in bringing African indigenous traditions to the continent of North America. That's where you see those two vocab words of Santeria and voodoo. Those are not native North American indigenous traditions. Those are actually native to Africa. So please go back and read that history. That's very important history. And you'll see as you study more about the history of religions, what roles, of course to the detriment of indigenous tradition, what role colonization plays in the detriment, sometimes the destruction, let's just be very honest, of indigenous traditions. So be sure you read that history. But going back to indigenous way of life in Africa, I'm on page 77. So be sure to read the historic before you head on to way of life. All right, we talked about anthropocentric. So on the continent of Africa in particular, African indigenous traditions are anthropocentric, meaning everything is focused on improving life right now, which means very specific rites and rituals that are practiced by people every day, infused in their everyday lives in order to improve the human condition right now. This would also include communication with the spirit world, which we talked about a little bit earlier, in order to glean wisdom for what to do right now. All right, so on page 78, we have the various forms of communication with the ancestors, including sacrifice, divination, spirit possession, using a medium, and then witchcraft. Be sure to read the portion on witchcraft. Witchcraft is not what you think it is in terms of the Western connotation of witchcraft. Be sure to read that particular paragraph so that you have a clearer sense, a more accurate sense on actually what that word means. So let me give you a very specific example. If you saw Black Panther, which is an incredible movie, and we all know that we already miss Chadwick Boseman very, very much, but King T'Challa, where does he travel to? When he needs wisdom, where does he go? Do you remember? He goes to the ancestral plane in order to glean wisdom from his father. So that movie actually did a very good job of depicting several different parts of African indigenous traditions. There's also some Hinduism mixed into Black Panther. And it's well documented that on the set of Black Panther and in the production of Black Panther, there was a focus on depicting African indigenous traditions accurately and showing the richness of history in African indigenous traditions, and in particular, these rituals that comprise the way of life. So divination in particular, spirit possession, sacrifice, these are all good, wonderful ways in which the way of life in African indigenous traditions is demonstrated in modern culture, in modern society, and this gives you a window into what that looks like. All right. Also, the documentaries that I posted also show you that when the young priestesses go for their divination, for their Ifa, that's on page 78 and 79, you see that. In other words, the priest who is initiating them uses divination with the palm nuts in order to get the Ifa for the priestesses that will help guide them in their journey towards becoming a priestess, serving others, and improving life for themselves and others today. Anthropocentric. All right, so we are moving on using, be sure to go through using supernatural powers, women in indigenous traditions. Let's talk a little bit more about rituals. Rituals are very important in African indigenous traditions. Your book has divided it into several different sections of rituals. Be sure to go back and read through those. But rites of passage. So you've heard of a rite of passage. In American culture, we have certain rites of passage. In African indigenous traditions, there are rites of passage. Birth, the passage from coming into the world, into the natural world, and then initiation rites, the transition into adulthood, and then death rituals, the transition into the spirit world. So be sure to read a bit about each of those. before you head on to the conclusion, which is on page 86. Your conclusion does a really great job of summarizing the effects of colonialism on the continent of Africa and therefore its effects on African indigenous traditions. So be sure you read that paragraph. Also, it highlights that Santeria and Voodoo are actually indigenous traditions from the continent of Africa that were brought over by enslaved Africans and that are now in the Americas. Those are probably two traditions that you've heard of, especially if you've been to southern United States. If you've been to New Orleans, you have likely heard of those two traditions. So what is the ultimate reality? How should we live? And what is the ultimate purpose? Let's talk about these three categories very quickly. Ultimate reality. Most African indigenous traditions have narratives that talk about some form of high God as the creator God, but they also have narratives that help explain why there is a separation between God and humanity. Typically, God has a very hands-off approach when it comes to involvement in African indigenous traditions. There's a particular story in the beginning of the chapter that will help you understand this. And because of this, African indigenous traditions rely on communication with the ancestors, the spirit world, to gain wisdom through divination, possession, sacrifice, in order to improve life today, which brings us to how should we live in this world. All right, there's an emphasis on caring and respecting both the living and the deceased members of the family and in the community. There is an emphasis on anthropocentrism, performing ceremonies and rituals that help improve life today. There is not an emphasis on punishment, sin, much like the Abrahamic faiths, where there's this idea that there are consequences for action and that affects the ultimate purpose. African indigenous traditions do not have that. Everything is focused on the here and now rather than the distant future of ultimate purpose. Therefore, the ultimate purpose is not one of salvation. It is one of how do you improve life today, and then the transition to the ancestral realm, the realm of the spirits of the dead, so that you then could be of use and of wisdom to those who are living now. So I hope that was helpful. That was your lecture summary for chapter 3. Again, not a substitute for reading your chapter. Be sure to go through your glossary and put a star by divination, Ifa, Orisha, medium, rites of passage, pantheon, Santeria, and voodoo. All right, be familiar with those and reread your conclusion. As always, read and watch everything in the modules so that you have a clearer, more in-depth understanding of this chapter. And I will see you soon for chapter 4, Hinduism. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.